Hi, welcome to Summer Connect's first Training Tuesday. I'm so glad you joined me. My name is Jill Fuhs. I'm coming to you from our Southern California studio, formerly known simply as my husband's office. I'm married to Bob Fuhs, whom you'll be hearing from later this week on the Thursday night broadcast, and we live here. We work with crew full-time. And tonight, I'm going to be talking to you about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, which is connecting with the Lord personally, spending intentional time with Him, studying His Word. There is really nothing else that you could put in your life this summer as a pattern that's going to make a bigger difference. Before I get started, though, I feel like I need to give credit where credit is due. I have learned so many of these things really from few sources. One is a book by the name of The Life You've Always Wanted by John Ortberg. That's on your note sheet. If you're scribbling down that name, it's already there. Also, Willow Creek Church from Chicago. I've learned a lot from them and their seminars. And then also, almost everything I know about studying the Bible, I learned from a ministry called Precept Upon Precept. Now, I just mentioned that note sheet, and hopefully you've found that. It should have been sent to you in an email. I would love for you to print that off, if at all possible, and be able to take notes. And then I'll be referring to some things on there as well. And just to let you know, this will probably be about 45 minutes. Hopefully you also saw there was a question on, I think, Instagram, Facebook, some places like that. And the question was, you can still chime in if you'd like, what's something you find yourself doing or saying that you've picked up from a friend? So something you find yourself doing or saying that you've picked up from a friend. I know that we've got a couple responses already. Devin Tressler, who lives in St. Louis, says, I started saying y'all when I made friends in Texas. Then when I moved back north, I stopped. So there's some influence there. Also, somebody else has, C.M. Burke has said that they used to say pop to refer to Coke and Pepsi, but now they say soda. So I can understand that. I've moved to a few places myself. I was in college and had to give a presentation, and I noticed myself doing this gesture, and I thought, well, this is strange. I've never moved my hands like this before. Why am I doing that? And then I saw my discipler giving a talk, and I went, aha, Peggy does that. That's why I'm like that. That's why I'm doing that. And then, of course, you know, obviously I spend a lot of time with my husband. Things are bound to rub off. So there was this time when we were still dating, and I heard him say the phrase, that fries my grapes. And I didn't know really what to think of that phrase. I mean, I could kind of tell by the context that it was something that made him mad. But otherwise, I had never heard anyone on the planet say that term, right? Still haven't 20 years later. But I will say I have picked up some nobler things from my husband, but I do occasionally hear myself saying that something fries my grapes. So why does that stuff happen? Sometimes it's a conscious choice. A lot of times it's just subconscious. You're around people long enough, you just end up picking up their mannerisms or the things that they say. Here's the good news. The same thing happens when you spend time with Jesus. As you spend intentional time with God, you can expect that He's going to rub off on you. And you may have even already seen this in your life. I know for me, the first thing that I ever saw change when I became a Christian was that I became less sarcastic. And I wasn't thinking about this. I wasn't trying to be less sarcastic. I just realized that after spending time with Him, it had begun to change. So perhaps you've discovered that maybe you're better able to show kindness or patience with people. Maybe you're less inclined to compare yourself to other people. Whatever it is for you, wouldn't it be great to have more of that? Well, that comes by developing your relationship with the Lord, and that really comes in part by spending some intentional time with Him, getting along with Him regularly in your life. It's a very important habit to begin to form here at the beginning of your summer so that you set the pace and you have that right trajectory to be able to have the rich spiritual summer that you probably want to have. So what if you didn't get alone with God ever? If you never spent time with Him, never connected with Him, never studied His Word? what would you be missing? Let's say you even still had the community that you have right now, but you just never spent time alone with God. Would you still be satisfied with your summer? I want you to take just a couple of minutes and think about that. I'm just going to be quiet because I want to give you a little time to think about what would happen if you didn't get alone this summer with God. Okay, sorry, I know that wasn't long. But I think there are some parallels even that we can see with just friends that you might hang out with often. You know, you might see a particular friend, you hang out, you watch a movie together, maybe you play some sports, things like that. But there is just this qualitative difference when you have a chance to have like a really meaningful conversation with them, you know, like a pillow talk type of conversation. Whether or not it's late at night, if you have a conversation like that with honesty, vulnerability, what you find is that you feel like you know that person so much better and that you're so much closer to them. And in the same way, there's just something qualitatively different about you spending time alone with God. Your communication, your level of connection is just focused, and over time, your relationship with God gets deeper and deeper and deeper. That's what you don't want to miss. Well, the word itself actually gives some great motivation to study it. I think you have written out on your notes Hebrews 4:12. It says, "For the word of God is living and active, sharper than any double-edged sword. It penetrates even to dividing soul and spirit, joints and marrow. It judges the thoughts and the attitudes of the heart." Now, the Bible is the Word of God, and as such, it is a supernatural book. There are a lot of books that I'm sure you could read this summer from various authors, but none of them are going to be able to make that claim. Look at 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17 too. This one says, "All scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that the man of God may be thoroughly equipped for every good work." I like to think of this actually as a road. So the Bible teaches us, here's the teaching part, it teaches us this is the road. Here's the curbs. Don't get outside of this road, but sometimes we do, don't we? Sometimes we jump the curb and we get outside the parameters God has for us. Well, that's why it says that the word rebukes us. It says, hey, you've gotten outside the boundaries. And then it corrects us by saying, here's how to get back on the road. And that training in righteousness is how we know how to stay on the road. All of those things are needed. And all of those things come from studying the Bible. The Bible is the source of those things in our lives. But without some intentionality on your part, you're going to miss out on the intimacy and the direction and the transformation that could have been yours. And really, nobody wants that. So here's where we're going for the rest of our time together. First, I want to talk about what it would actually look like for you to connect with the Lord regularly. This would be something that you're going to do often, perhaps even daily, to refresh your ongoing relationship with the Lord. And after that, I want to show you also a method for digging deeper in the Word and actually studying it. Now, if that sounds like two somewhat different things, that's because it is two somewhat different things. You probably aren't actually studying the scriptures every time you sit down to meet with the Lord. That's kind of a different type of activity than you would do daily with Him. When I was in high school and college, I was hearing that I was to have a quiet time every day. Have you heard this term, quiet time? I will intentionally not be using that phrase today. It's just kind of a strange one to me. It doesn't fry my grapes or anything like that. But I just think it's a strange piece of Christianese. But anyway, the concept behind it is very, very good, and I wanted to do what I could to be a good Christian. But I ended up taking a road that is just all too common for people to take when it comes to meeting with the Lord, and that was the legalism road. So subconsciously, I kind of threw out the real purpose of connecting with God, and I had replaced that with boxes to check off. So first of all, I had in my head that this quiet time needed to last an hour. And it also needed to have 4 elements. They were that I was going to worship God, so I was going to listen to some music, I was going to work on my scripture memory, I was going to study the scriptures, and I was going to pray for a while. So sometimes I would spend an hour, but I didn't do all 4 things, and so I really kind of felt like a failure. Other times I would do all 4 of those things, but it didn't take quite an hour, so again, felt like a failure. In retrospect, I'd give myself an A for effort, but where I actually failed was in the area that was the most important. I just became more concerned with performing up to a set of standards that I had sort of made for myself, rather than meeting with the Lord and enjoying the Lord. It can be easy to lose sight of the purpose, but the bottom line goal of what we're talking about today really comes from Matthew 22:36 through 40. And this is where Jesus is talking about how the greatest commandment is to love the Lord, and that the second greatest commandment is to love others. So the goal is to love God more and love people more. It's easy to get sidetracked, but that's the true end goal. Growing in love for God and seeing Him transform you into a better lover of people. Well, even with all of that said, I think spending time regularly with the Lord can fall into the same category as flossing your teeth, right? And that category is that knowing all the benefits doesn't necessarily translate into action. The specific distractions that you have and I have, they're probably going to be a little bit different, especially because we're all in different situations this summer. And I think it would be a really good idea for you after this is over to ask yourself the question, what are things that keep me personally from spending time alone with God? This is also on your note sheet. It's in the reflection questions. I would love for you to ask yourself that and maybe even be creative trying to come up with a way to get over that hurdle. I do know that if you spend some time thinking about these 3 ingredients in advance that I'm about to tell you, you're more likely to see your good intentions actually become action. And those 3 things are thinking through a time and a place and a plan. So let's start with time. What do you think is more important, quality time or quantity time? So, raise your hand if you'd say, oh, quantity time is more important. Okay. Which of you would say, no, quality time is more important? All right. Okay, I really can't see you at all. But I'm hoping that you raised your hand for quality time, because that's what I think really is more important. And one of the things that makes quality time quality is that it's unhurried. So I think even 15 minutes of unhurried time, like uninterrupted, undistracted, that kind of time with the Lord is better, I think, than twice that amount of time just snatched between 2 events where concentration is really difficult. Ideally, you want to set aside a time where you can give your full attention to your relationship with God, where you can be focused and you can be relaxed and able to listen. And those things rarely happen when your head or your heart is hurried. Now, you also may want to go on a quest to find the best place for you to meet with the Lord, a place where maybe you're free from social distractions or noise or maybe stimulation, where you can just focus and enjoy your time with God. But let's say you've got a time and you've got a place. Well, what do? What now? If you want to communicate with God and really connect with Him, the 2 pillars of this time that you're setting aside are really going to be praying and reflecting on the Word. So think of it like talking to God and Him talking to us. How that ends up looking for each person really is a little different, because everyone's uniquely created by God, right? So we all might connect with God in our own unique way. But I think in its simplest form, I would suggest that you settle into this place that you've found, spend some time in prayer, and I would say in that, you want to include a prayer where you're just expressing your desire to learn and hear from the Lord. Then read a passage, meditate on it, Perhaps you want to journal about it, maybe not. And then try to take one thought with you for the rest of the day. Now, some people get really creative with this. I knew one artistic woman, and she would get out a piece of paper and divide it in half vertically. She'd write the verse that she was looking at on the left-hand side, and then she would draw on the right-hand side what that verse made her think of or how it inspired her. Another person I know would look at some of the stories in the biographies of Jesus, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then they would write some paragraphs of prose, picking out one of the characters from that story and writing from that person's perspective. So I thought that was really creative. You might hear that and go, oh my goodness, I would dread meeting with God if I had to do that. If that's the case, then by all means, don't do that. I don't like to journal. Wish I did, but I don't. So I don't journal very much. That's okay. It makes sense if God has made us differently, that we're going to connect with Him differently. And that brings me to the concept of spiritual pathways. You may have even seen beforehand and taken the test that we sent you. There's an assessment that talks about what is your spiritual pathway. If not, you can do it afterwards. That's okay. But the idea behind spiritual pathways is just, how do you best connect with God? You'll see there's categories like relational, nature, worship, contemplative, intellectual, all sorts of things like that. And some people very naturally connect with God in some pathways as opposed to others. My friend Carrie, who will be the Thursday night speaker in a few weeks, she has the pathway of nature. And I know this not because she took the assessment and told me about that, but simply because it is obvious. We would go maybe, to a fall retreat in the mountains or something, and we'd walk outside our cabin, and she would look up and just go, she would bust out with Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glories of God, the skies proclaim the works of His hand, and me, this non-nature pathway person, would look up and go, oh, yeah, I guess. There was just something about being in nature that caused Carrie to be reminded of God and experience Him in a very special way. Maybe some of you can relate to that. Maybe your soul is just replenished when you get out in nature and when you see God in His creation. Others of you probably connect best with God maybe in times of worship with other believers, or maybe you connect with God in the silence or through learning or through relationships with others. My top pathways are contemplative and intellectual. So this, read through the Bible in a year plan, that's a real bummer for me. To me, that just seems like plowing through material in order to check off a box, when what I need is space and freedom to be able to really digest the word slowly and to be able to just stop and pray and meditate on a verse whenever something catches my eye. So if you come to understand your spiritual pathways or how best you connect with the Lord, you can make a point to work that thing into your life regularly so that you can maximize your experience with the Lord. For instance, if your pathway is relational, perhaps sometimes you might want to get together with 2 or 3 other friends and study the Word together. Other times you might want to stretch yourself and spend time with God alone, but it might help you to know that afterward you have a plan to meet with a friend and tell them everything that the Lord was teaching you and all the things that you thought of. It makes a lot of sense, doesn't it, that if we're uniquely made by God, that we wouldn't all connect with Him in the same way. And let me throw out this challenge while we're talking about it. Of course, you would want to make room to incorporate the pathways that are yours into the regular course of your days, right? But don't just write off the pathways that aren't very natural for you. Because if you could stretch yourself to experience God in more ways, through more pathways, then you're going to be able to experience Him more often in more ways throughout your day. I mentioned earlier that I wasn't much of a nature pathway girl. But I took this challenge myself, and I thought, well, how can I begin to see God more often in nature? And I realized for Carrie, it really was more the big picture, like when she would see the vast horizon or the big sky. And for me, it wasn't that, but I realized that I'm really kind of fascinated by the details in nature. And specifically, I don't know why these three things, but specifically fruit, animals, and flowers. There's this flower up in Los Angeles, and it's got these tiny petals, and they're white on one side and purple on the underneath side, and they're just amazing. And whiskers on a cat. Who thinks of that, right? And fruit, I mean, you look at all the colors and the shapes and the sizes and the seeds and all of that. I mean, I think it's rather amazing now. And what's fun is that I'm noticing these things because I've kind of pushed myself in this nature pathway. And because I've done this, I'm beginning to see God and enjoy His creativity in places where I never saw Him before. So I would encourage you to stretch yourself in addition to making lots of room for your natural pathway. Okay, let me review this first section then. We said that the goal of connecting and communicating with God is to see transformation in our lives, right? To love God more and to love people more. And we talked about some important elements of a regular time with Him, like finding a good time and a good place and having a plan. And in that plan, you would want to pray, you'd want to read the scriptures, you'd want to meditate on what you read, keeping in mind your spiritual pathways. Okay, so one of your assignments that I want you to do this week is to take the spiritual pathways assessment if you haven't already. And then I want you to do something to connect with God along the lines of your pathway. So you're practicing your pathway. And tweet or Instagram about that using the hashtag Training Tuesday and Summer Connect 16. Okay? All right. Well, let's move on then. So this type of reading of the scriptures and meditating that we've been talking about, like I mentioned before, is really more of a devotional time with God. It's not really digging into the Bible and studying a passage. So with the remainder of our time, I'd like to introduce you to a method where you could do that. You could, on occasion, incorporate times of studying the Bible in your time with the Lord. You may have heard of this method. It's actually rather common. It's called the inductive Bible study method. And the reason it's called that is that it employs inductive reasoning. So you're looking at specifics and then kind of inferring broader things because of those specifics. But don't worry, you don't need to really understand the title in order to successfully do the method. So the inductive Bible study method, though, has three parts. They are observation, interpretation, and application. So observation, interpretation, application. And I'm going to go back and take some time on each one of these, give it some definition, and talk about some how-tos. So let's start with observation. Observation is the process of determining what the passage says. So it answers the question, what does it say? Now, this is actually the hard work of Bible study. It's not the exciting work. It's easy to want to skip this part, but it's extremely important. And to get you thinking about all that's involved in observation, I'm going to give you a couple minutes to observe a picture that I'm going to show you. And so while you're observing that, I want you to, first of all, find Waldo. And secondly, I want you to just think about what insights can you make about observation from this exercise. So I'm just going to give you about a minute to look at this picture. Okay, what are some insights that you can make about observation from this exercise? I think, it takes time, right? The longer you look at it, the more you see. And there's more there than you might see at first glance. Like you can look at this one and immediately go, oh, okay, beach scene, right? But you don't really know the particulars, including Waldo's whereabouts, until you look much harder. So the essence of the Bible, it can be understood by the simplest of minds, and it can also keep theologians busy for a lifetime. It's more intricately designed than this Where's Waldo picture. Let's talk about then the how-tos for observation. First of all, maybe this is obvious, but you want to read and reread the passage. Okay, read and reread. And then you want to ask yourself a bunch of questions. You want to ask yourself who, what, when, where, why, how, all of those sorts of things. If you were reading a passage, let's say, you would want to ask yourself, well, who wrote it? And who did they write it to? Just be asking yourself all those questions. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. I want to show you one method that I use where I ask these questions. And this is one where I would, I think we have a slide. It's 2 Timothy 2, 3 through 7. And I think it's a little hard to see, so I apologize for that. But I have a sheet of paper that actually has a column for each of these questions. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. And so in this particular case, you can see that I have written out each verse. And the first one is 2 Timothy 2, 3, which says, suffer hardship with me as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. So I have suffer hardship there under what? That is the what of that sentence. The who, well, who is the author? With me, Paul. Jesus Christ is also a who. Understood, I suppose, is Timothy that he's writing to. And how is as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. So you won't fill up every column for every verse, obviously. But what happens is you end up writing out every verse by putting it where you think it fits under each of those columns. Another thing that you might want to do to observe is mark. So in this method, I actually would print out the text that I'm studying, and then I would maybe mark different words in different ways, like with different colors or with different symbols. I think I also have a slide of this so you can see what this might look like. And this is the method of precept upon precept, which I said I'd learned a lot from. Sometimes then you can go even farther. After I've marked these words, let's say I've marked suffering, which I obviously would have done in 2 Timothy because that's a key theme. And then I might make a list also of all the things that that says about suffering. So those are the methods of observation. Read and reread, ask yourself these questions, mark and make lists. What's the point? Like, why would you do these things? Because I know it can seem to some people like busy work. Well, here's the point. It slows you down. We have such a tendency to read something and go, oh yeah, got it, right? I see it. But these methods force you to take a much harder and much longer look than you are naturally inclined to take. Successful Bible study is 90% perspiration and only 10% inspiration. Okay, so if observation is answering the question, what does it say? Interpretation answers the question, what does it mean? Let me tell you a little story. You might have heard it before. It goes like this. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Okay, if you're near a pen and a piece of paper, here's what I want you to do. I want you to draw Humpty Dumpty. Now, I'm going to play the Jeopardy theme song, which means you have only 30 seconds, so don't be too fancy. But take some time right now and draw Humpty Dumpty. Go ahead. Okay, done? Okay. Sorry. I've tried this with other groups in the past, so I have a pretty good hunch that most of you just drew an egg. Am I right? Why did you draw an egg? the story said nothing about an egg. The reason that you drew an egg is that somebody, who knows who, long ago, interpreted this story that Humpty Dumpty was an egg. And so now we all think Humpty Dumpty is an egg. So see, if you don't observe well, you don't interpret well. So it's really, really important that you observe well, because you're probably approaching the scriptures with some preconceived ideas, and some of them are right, but some of them may not be right. Interpretation is all about what things mean, but how do you find out what things mean? Well, for instance, let's say you're studying 2 Timothy. I know I keep bringing that up. It really would be a good idea to study 2 Timothy. It's a good book. In chapter 1, you will have observed that Paul is the author and Timothy is the recipient of the letter, but how could you go about finding out more information about Timothy? Well, one way is with cross-references, and not every Bible has cross-references, but if yours does, you will see little tiny letters by some of the words in the verses. And then in the margins or down at the very bottom of your Bible, you'll find the verse and then you'll find that little letter, and there will be a list of other verses that give further insight into whatever that word is. Isn't that great? So in this case, you can look at other verses and see more about Timothy's upbringing and his relationship with Paul and things like that. It's really fascinating. Another thing that's great is historical context. So you might want to find out when this particular book of the Bible was written, and then when you do, you can look up what was going on in the world then, or what was going on in the church. Some things like that really help. A third thing, which I do a lot, is find definitions, so meanings of words. For instance, suffering, like I said, which is a key theme in 2 Timothy. I mean, it's simple, but you could just look it up in Webster's. A lot of times I find that gives me some insight. Another thing that's even more meaningful to me is that I have a couple of books that I use. These are Hardy books. Here's one of them. Here's the other. Sadly, you have to have them both. Might be a Christmas present, something to ask for. But they are also written on the bottom of your note sheet, so don't worry if those went by too fast. These are Greek study tools. There's also some Hebrew ones, but these are where you can look up the Greek meanings of the words. These books were written by a man by the name of Spiros Zodhiates, and if you cannot trust a man named Spiros Zodhiates to tell you what a Greek word means, then you can't trust anybody. So these are great books. I've learned so much from them. The cheaper but not quite as informative method of finding out the meaning of the word might be to go to a couple websites. One is blueletterbible.org and the other is studylight.org. And you can get some definitions, Greek definitions, off those websites as well. So now let me also point out that if you have a study Bible, the information at the bottom is actually a commentary, and it's written by a person after they've done their own study of the Word. So I would encourage you to resist reading their conclusions of their own Bible study until you do your own Bible study. Otherwise, I feel like you could really rob yourself of self-discovery and the depth that you can have in your own relationship with the Lord by studying the Word yourself. After you're done, feel free to find out what somebody else thought after their own study. But I would say only compare your conclusions to a commentary. Okay, so observation answers the question, what does it say? Interpretation answers, what does it mean? So what do you think application answers? The tendency here is to think application answers the question, what does it mean to me? But you have to be really careful about that, because honestly, it doesn't really matter what it means to you. The only thing that matters is what the author originally intended it to mean to his audience. So the better question to put there by application is, how can I apply the meaning to my life? How can I apply the meaning to my life? D.L. Moody once said that the Bible wasn't given for our inspiration, but our transformation. Application is the central reason for God's revelation. If it doesn't change you, you've kind of missed the whole point. Another good name for this time in your study might be listening to God's voice. So at this point, you've taken a long, hard work or look at this passage. You have worked at understanding its meaning and its message. Now is just the perfect time to quiet yourself before God and ask Him to speak to you through His Word. So I want you to begin by listing the timeless principles from the passage. And then second, relate those principles to your life. Third, decide on steps of action and be specific and current. So questions to help you would be things like, what am I to believe? What am I to do? What changes? Are changes needed? And what do I learn about how I relate to God, others, creation, and myself? Making it stick is always the hardest part of application, isn't it? I would encourage you to write down any applications that you think of. And in some cases, depending on what it is you want to apply, you might need to tell another friend and ask them to keep you accountable. Okay, so here's a question for you. What do you think is the most important? Is it observation, interpretation, or application? What do you think? It's a tough one, isn't it? They're all so important. But I do think there is one that edges out the others. And so the most important award goes to observation. It does, observation. Because if you observe poorly, you will interpret poorly, and you will apply poorly. Out of good observation flows sound interpretation and appropriate application. But if you're off that straight mark in your observation, then your interpretation is going to be even farther off and your application even farther off. So don't skimp on the observation. Pick some sort of activity to slow yourself down and force yourself to notice what you otherwise would not have. And remember, only here at the end of your study is when you can look at commentaries and see what other people thought. And if you disagree with them, you have a couple options. The first is to disagree. The second is that you can see what other people thought, read other commentaries, and then maybe think about or investigate it from their perspective. Okay, back to assignments. So in addition to the Pathways assessment and posting your Pathways pick, I also want you sometime this week to try this inductive study method with a passage of Scripture. And I would suggest you could go ahead and start at the beginning of 2 Timothy chapter 1. Another great passage would also be Ephesians 2, 1 through 10. I think you'd really enjoy that as well. Also, I just think it'd be really fun to see your Humpty Dumpty pictures if you wanted to post those to Instagram. We could all enjoy them. Don't give away the point, but we can look at them, and then the people who didn't tune in for this will just be really confused and wonder what they missed. So at the bottom of your note page, you'll see there are some reflection questions. Those are also great group questions if you happen to be in a group. And also then all the books that I've mentioned in the course of this, and then a couple suggestions for books that I've used in my times with the Lord have been very good if you want something like that. It's Thirsty by Rick James, and then also one by Kay Arthur, Lord, I Want to Know You, and this looks at the character of God by looking at the Hebrew names in the order that they're mentioned in the Old Testament. Well, thanks again for tuning in. I hope this was super helpful. I hope this makes a huge difference in your summer and in your relationship with the Lord. I think by, taking the time to go ahead and tune in, you must really want this to be a great summer and a great time with the Lord. And so I will pray that that is exactly what happens. Don't forget to tune in also this Thursday, 48 hours from now, same time, same place. And Bob will be speaking that night. Okay? Thanks again, you guys. Bye-bye.